Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The New Carbon Market and the Brazilian Amazon Forest. My name is Dan Nepstad. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Innovation Institute, which is hosting this webinar. Our focus today is to share results of a study that bears the same title as the webinar. It's available on our website. The question of the future of the Amazon and the rising trend in deforestation has begged the question of how can we turn the curve and bend the arc on forest loss and degradation. This is the topic that we'll be exploring today. I invite everyone on the webinar, either participating directly through the Zoom channel or through YouTube, to ask questions throughout the seminar. My job as moderator will be to make sure that the right panelist gets us to that, to answer that question. I will introduce the speakers once I have wonderful pictures of them to share with you within my presentation. Today, as panelists, we have Monica de los Rios, coordinator of the Brazil program of the Earth Innovation Institute, Ronaldo Seroa da Motta, World Authority on Environmental Services, Payments for Ecosystem Services, professor at the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro, an economist, Caroline Del Prolo at Stock Forbes Law Office, an expert on Brazil's climate policy and the international climate regime, and Ludovino Lopes, the founding partner of Ludovino Lopes Law Offices, and a longtime scholar and practitioner of the legal dimensions of making REDD plus operational. The topics I'll cover in my presentation, which will be followed by short interventions from each of the panelists, include what is the new carbon market and what is jurisdictional red and how far along are the Brazilian states of the Amazon region gotten in preparing to sell credits from jurisdictional red programs, what that means in terms of potential revenues through these sales and the implications for Brazil's decarbonization pathway. Closing with a few comments about next steps to make this all operational. First of all, Brazil has had a very dramatic history of efforts to slow deforestation. Here we show annual deforestation since 1995, the ups and downs, and the major interventions that were brought forth to reduce the loss of forests. The dotted line across the middle is the average deforestation rate for the 1996 to 2005 period, where we can see that although we're still below that average today, since 2012, deforestation has tripled. And although there are many reasons why deforestation is rising, one of them is certainly a lack of finance. Brazil successfully achieved more than 7 billion tons of reductions of CO2 emissions through its successful efforts beginning 2004 through the PPCDAN strategy to reduce deforestation. And only 4% of that has been compensated, mostly through the Amazon Fund. So there is this chronic lack of finance for Brazilian forests, keeping them strong, keeping them standing, and funding a new type of development model that is forest dependent and forest recovering. And part of our question today is, could the new carbon market plug that gap? What do we mean when we say new carbon market? One dimension of this new market is rising demand. The net zero movement, which the Race to Zero Alliance now has more than 5,000 companies registered, means that there's a new market demand for high quality carbon credits. And many companies are turning to forests and turning to the large-scale forest programs called jurisdictional RED, as we'll get into. But we also have decisions around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that will soon, that provide a framework for new international transactions of emissions reductions. And on the supply side, jurisdictional RED, which will soon become operational in terms of delivering credits to this market. These are all different dimensions of the new carbon market. Bear with me with the Portuguese info diagram, but today there's two mechanisms that are operational for delivering climate finance to emissions reductions programs that are successfully reducing emissions. The first is something called payment for results, results-based payments, in which a donation is made and the recipient is a government, and those proceeds make it to multiple beneficiaries, but there's no credit transacted. There's no credit returned to the donor. Rather, Brazil, in this case, retires those emissions reductions so that they cannot be the basis of a further donation. This is the basis of the Amazon Fund transactions, and it is delivered something like $1.7 billion to Brazil so far, and could result in a further flow of some $4 to $13 billion that Ronaldo will talk more about these projections. Then there's also a voluntary market for RED projects. These are projects that are not linked to governments. They're independent, and they have resulted in the flow of some tens of millions of dollars, and could be the source of another 1 to 6 billion coming into Brazil for forests. Then there's three new types of transactions that are on the near-term horizon. One is the sale by Brazilian states of credits into the voluntary carbon market, and in which the seller would be a mixed economy, public-private partnership entity that's connected to the government, has the right to sell those credits. And those credits could be sold to governments or to more likely to businesses. The buyer will more likely be a business. And the beneficiaries are multiple stakeholders: indigenous people, farm sectors, businesses, because they're part of integrated jurisdiction-wide programs. There have been no transactions to date under this, and we will share with you how we estimate that this could deliver 13 to 48 billion to the Brazilian Amazon states by 2030. There's two other new mechanisms that are still being regulated and operationalized. One for internationally transferred mitigation outcomes under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. These will be government-to-government transactions. And then under Article 6.4, a new mechanism that will involve governments or businesses. The total of these Article 6 transactions could be as much as 72 billion for Brazil by 2030. What makes jurisdictional RED programs different as a high source of high quality credits that are delivering benefits to many stakeholders? That's the essential difference right there. One is a difference of scale, right? Where the boundaries of a jurisdictional program are, in the case of Brazil, the state boundaries. So these are very large territories. And the core idea here is one of shifting the development model to a development model that is forest positive. These are cross-sector programs. They do not involve a single type of land user or land holder. They involve a prominent role for governments, for farm sectors, indigenous people, businesses, and civil society. And the scale at which they operate means that there's fewer issues of leakage and permanence. Brazilian Amazon states have been preparing for this market for years. Many states have the legal framework needed to transact carbon credits. They're implementing guiding principles for collaboration with indigenous people and local communities, negotiated over years and finalized in 2019 through the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. Some have statewide programs already in place that are delivering benefits, climate finance benefits to indigenous people, for example, in Mato Grosso and Acre. And these same states have had very positive experiences with pay-for-performance contracts with the governments of Germany and the United Kingdom. So to estimate the potential revenues of the sale of credits from jurisdictional REDD programs, we applied actually 4 different baselines, but we'll talk about only 2 of them today, that from ART-TREES and that from JNR, the jurisdictional nested REDD standard of Vera. There's 4 types of carbon fluxes that we evaluated. One from the loss of primary forests or deforestation, emissions from primary forests, reductions of emissions from forest degradation, including logging and forest fire, reductions of emissions from secondary forest deforestation, and then the additional increases in removal of CO2 by secondary forests that result with that reduced loss of secondary forests. And our main data were PRODES and MAPBiomas. This is the basic scenario that we looked at. It's a forest positive scenario in that total forest area increases by 2030, part because deforestation is reduced 90%, forest degradation is reduced 90% as well, relative to the early aughts, 2001 to 2010. And we see this light green forest, this is secondary forest, today at about 16 million hectares. We see that expanding, and then on top, added area of restored forest. And so what we can see in this scenario too is the dotted line, which are net emissions, which today are somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. And in this scenario, that gets down to about negative 200 million tons per year. That, in other words, the Amazon becomes a large net sink. This is apart from the sink often referred to for standing primary forests. So we do not include that in this estimate. So it's about a 900 million ton per year shift in emissions that we analyzed. And here's a sample state estimate where we look at the historical pattern of deforestation and then forecasted emissions with a linear projection down to that 90% reduction. And then the FREL, or the reference level, based upon the standard, in this case ART-TREES, and the yellow representing the emissions reductions below that standard. So this is what we did for the 4 different carbon types in every state of the Brazilian Amazon. Here we can also, you can see on a state level where the emissions reductions are relative to NDC targets. The bottom line is that there's a lot of finance that could flow to the Amazon, even with a price of about $10 per ton. The transactions so far for the Brazil have been $5 per ton through the Amazon Fund, through the REDD for Early Mover programs that Mato Grosso and Acre have been the beneficiaries of. And the price could be higher as well. So the bottom line is the transaction of jurisdictional REDD credits could deliver a very large increase in the flow of finance for keeping forests standing and for favoring a forest positive development trajectory in the Amazon. There's another implication here though, and here we see the SIG data for annual emissions, where the lower part of the column, the sort of turquoise on my screen, that's land use. So that includes Amazon deforestation, degradation. And it is such a big chunk of Brazil's total greenhouse gas inventory, total annual emissions, that with the scenario that we analyzed, it basically allows Brazil, even if the other sectors do have no reductions in emissions, to not only achieve, but to surpass its NDCs, Brazil's NDC commitments under Paris, its nationally determined contributions. And this is really key, because the definition of credits with corresponding adjustments are those credits that will not be claimed by Brazil towards its NDC. These are emissions reductions above and beyond Paris commitments. These are credits that will fetch a better price, perhaps $30 to $50 a ton. And these are going to be essential to fund the more expensive dimensions of Brazil's decarbonization process. So very significant in terms of the national decarbonization process are the potential to really put these jurisdictional programs into operation with the sale of credits, generating the revenues needed to lower emissions. So next steps, although there are no legal barriers to the transaction of these credits, there's still not a green light from the federal government either for the states to proceed. There's an urgent need to begin developing a federal and state collaborative strategy to reduce emissions from forests, because they're so central to the national decarbonization agenda. And what is urgently needed as well is a national system for governing, for registering, for allocating, and for bringing greater transparency to emissions reductions and how they'll be allocated in terms of which sectors can use credits with corresponding adjustments that will fetch a much higher price. So in conclusion, the carbon market is poised to deliver a significant share of the missing Amazon forest finance, making very clear, of course, that finance is one piece of what is needed to bend the arc in the Amazon. And there are other issues, but it's a very important piece. Steep reductions in Amazon emissions would make large volumes of corresponding credits with corresponding adjustments feasible for Brazil. In this scenario, about 500 million tons by 2030. Multiply that by 30 or 50. And although there are no legal barriers for jurisdictional red transactions by the states, the lack of a green light from the federal government is acting as an inhibitory factor. Thank you very much. So it's now my pleasure to turn over to the first intervention from our panel. Professor Ronaldo Seroa da Motta, I turn it over to you to discuss some of the economic dimensions of our study.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to be part of the study, and I thank you all the people attending this webinar. And I think there is first of all, you should try to understand how forest credits are doing in the voluntary market, because this is the market which is already in place, which is today is the major source of demand for avoid deforestation, reforestation credit, REDD+ type of credit. And we've seen in the last 3 years, this voluntary market has increased by 300%, and in trade in physical term. And also, we have seen REDD+, many use project leading not only the trade volume, but also with the highest price. And so, but at the end of the day, until the information we have so far, price, the average price, because you see in the voluntary market, you have a price for project, you can come up with some average, which gives you a price for a ton of carbon equivalent. And this price of average price for carbon, a ton of carbon equivalent, has been almost with no change in the last year. Why you triple? There's 300% increase in the volume you buy, and it's still the price is still at the same level. And the question is there an explanation for that? Yes. First of all, you should think this is something we all leading in the voluntary market. When you buy a credit, we have to deal with the very important issue of integrity, climate integrity. And so it's very difficult for someone who is buying a credit to be very sure that credit is going to be performing well, which means that the reductions or the removal they're promising is going to take place. Is going to take place for several years ahead. That's something which is very difficult to make sure. Of course, there is certifications, and certification gives you some kind of diligence, trying to make you sure that that's you buy, that's what you're going to get at the end. But it's still, it's something very difficult for carbon credits coming from red. As you said, the leakage and permanence are very hard issue. And jurisdictional reds, they remove that. And so if you have a jurisdictional red, you may end up with some credit which may be able to get a higher price just because it's jurisdiction. The second point is the voluntary market is facing a challenge today is regarding how can I claim the credits I'm buying. I mean, if you don't have a corresponding adjustment, which is the NEDC corresponding adjustment, which we're going to see, we have these in Article 6 of Paris Agreement. Whatever I sell, I have to adapt to my NEDC because someone is going to use that. It's on NEDC who is going by to this is going to use that for achieving its NEDC. So I have to add up the amount I sold to avoid double counting. And today, VERA, for example, VCS, for example, has delivered a claim code of practice saying, if you don't have a corresponding adjustment in the credit you buy, you should say so. So everybody knows you're perhaps helping someone to finance the NEDC, but you're not reducing the global overall emission. You are not aligned with the science-based targets. And this is something which comes to the second point when red or land use red plus credit can get a premium if you have a corresponding adjustment. I think Carolina is going to give us a very good picture what is going on in the regulation of Article 6, which is the market instrument, as Tom mentioned before. But they all said in Glasgow is already decided. A lot of things needs to be decided further. But one thing is that the main important thing has been decided in Glasgow. Everyone who is selling within the framework of the convention, within the framework of the CORSIA, which is any international convention approach, if someone is going to use this, who is buying for accomplishing some kind of goals in the climate convention and the civil aviation, international civil aviation convention, should apply the corresponding adjustment. And all the studies we have reviewed, they say, of course, when you apply a corresponding adjustment, supply is going to be restrained and demand is going to grow, because now I can buy something which is really aligned with the science-based targets. I'm really doing something. When I buy a credit corresponding adjustment, I'm still in the science-based curve. And if I have a correspondent adjustment, I can sell to the Article 6 markets. As you said, this is very promising because there will be a market for countries to make contracts and entities also doing contracts in the two different instruments. It's a huge potential market we may have in the future. Perhaps in the future, I mean, perhaps 1 to 2 years. I think Carolina can tell you more about this progress. But we needed to take advantage of this, and not only with the jurisdictional, but also having some kind of governance in Brazil, which may decide what are the criteria to apply correspondent adjustment. And also we have this criteria, and this criteria is going to benefit the jurisdictional, right? Brazil has been able to benefit for making most of the competitive advantage we have today. Every study they saying Brazil may take 30, 40, 50% of the supply, the potential supply of land use, REDD plus credits. But you still have only less than 10%. You sell today less than Peru, who has a very jurisdictional and very comprehensive approach for forestry credit. And so we needed to make some adjustment in the legal and regulatory framework in Brazil to allow that. But just the final message, there is no way of moving forward, not only because you won't be able to have these assets from NDC if you don't control deforestation in Brazil. Of course, most of the credibility of selling Brazil credits in the market, any market, voluntary, regulated, whatever, we needed to show you are decreasing deforestation rate in Brazil as we did before. Thank you very much, Dan. That's the words I would say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronaldo. And let me just remind everyone to please use the Q&A function if you're on Zoom or if you're on YouTube, and we will get those questions to the panelists. We'd now like to turn to the international framework under Article 6 with contributions from Caroline Prolo, who just spent 3 weeks in Bonn and is steeped in the negotiations around Article 6 and how it could be actually implemented in Brazil for a forest positive development trajectory in the Amazon. Caro.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Thank you very much, Dan, for the invitation to be here today. Well, the carbon market instruments under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, they, as you know, allow country buyers to fulfill their NDC obligations, but they also can allow private parties to fulfill their corporate commitments. And Brazil, of course, has many opportunities to participate in these market instruments, and especially to use such carbon markets to promote the conservation of the Amazon rainforest. And that is also because historically the laws and law enforcement initiatives to promote conservation of the Brazilian rainforests in Brazil have failed tremendously. And then when you think of a jurisdictional program for compensation for forest conservation as such as the one we've been discussing here, this looks very promising as a tool that will enable the Brazilian government to ensure the conservation of this important Amazon rainforest, and especially when this is combined with the robust and the institutional frameworks and mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, the Article 6 mechanisms. So looking specifically at the opportunities under Article 6, as Dan and Ronaldo already mentioned, there are 2 market instruments under Article 6.2 and 6.4. Article 6.2 recognizes that parties can cooperate with each other and they can mutually transfer the mitigation outcomes, which then can be used to account for the fulfillment of the NDC of the receiving party in this transaction. So in other words, this means that those emission reductions or removals that a country achieves in its own territory can be transferred to another country, which would then have the exclusive right to use these reductions or removals to fulfill its NDC. And such mitigation outcomes are the so-called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, the ITMOs. What is interesting about ITMOs is that because they are subject to metrics and accounting rules that can be decided between transferring countries, of course, provided that the minimum rules that are provided by the Paris Agreement and which are being currently negotiated as Dan already mentioned, I was in Bonn and I was had the opportunity to follow these negotiations. So there are a few rules that are still being negotiated, but a lot of the metrics and the guidelines are going to be decided between the parties. So there is quite a lot of flexibility for parties to create new types of carbon units with less transaction costs and less fixed legal or technical requirements than project-based offsets, for instance. So this creates more options for emission reductions and removals, and to that end, jurisdictional approaches are a great fit because it's basically from government to government deciding on the rules for mitigation. And of course, speaking about governments, from an implementation point of view, because ITMOs are issued by country parties, parties to the Paris Agreement, the Brazilian federal government needs to be involved at least at some point, but ideally the private sector or of course subnational governments could develop ITMOs fit initiatives that can be captured in an overarching national policy. So in this sense, the Brazilian government could design a national program of some sort to provide the governance and the taxonomy for activities that can deliver ITMOs and include JRED to that end. So there's a lot of opportunities to build this governance, as Ronaldo mentioned as well, to make sure that these arrangements can be in place. And on Article 6.4, on the other hand, we have a crediting mechanism to certify projects that can deliver real, verified, and additional emission reductions and removals in a very similar manner to the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM of the Kyoto Protocol. And again, these projects can also be proposed by private parties and non-state actors, and will have to be approved by a supervisory body which is established under the Paris Agreement, has very recently been created, and it's now ready to start meeting and deciding on the general rules for the functioning of the mechanism. And these mechanism will issue units that are still have no name other than Article 6.4 emission reductions. So again, of course, the new mechanism also provides opportunities for engagement in terms of jurisdictional approaches, and it can be used to build some sort of new gold standard of innovative carbon projects or programs that can can raise Brazilian projects and promote the jurisdictional approaches in the Amazon rainforest as well. But of course, the issue here, particularly in terms of implementation, is that this still requires a methodology, a specific methodology on jurisdictional REDD+ to be approved by the supervisory body of the Article 6.4 mechanism. So this will probably still require a couple of years, perhaps less, but we still need this step to enable the full operationalization of Article 6.4 in the context of JREDD+. And one, I think, final point to highlight. I know that's a lot to talk about Article 6 and specifically on the all the arrangements of corresponding adjustments and everything. But I'm going to finalize here with an important highlight. As I mentioned before, that Article 6 can also be used for what is being called other international mitigation purposes, purposes that are not related to the fulfillment of an NDC. So this means that these JREDD+ initiatives can generate both ITMOs under Article 6.2 and emission reductions unit under Article 6.4 once it is a methodology is properly approved. Which can be used by the voluntary carbon markets. So it can be used by private parties that have corporate voluntary commitments and that wish to purchase units that are clearly consistent with the objective of the Paris Agreement. So these can, of course, increase their value in the global market and possibly make this as the new carbon units, the new trend in terms of the state of the art of the carbon markets. Of course, there's the issue of the proper application of corresponding adjustments. So this is this will call for some guidance from the national governments to understand how these programs and projects will not affect Brazil's national budget. But of course, there's some work to do, but there's also a lot of opportunities, and it's worth investing in this approach, in my opinion. I guess that's all for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolini. We now turn to Monica de los Rios. Monica, I realize, I'm sorry, Monica, I failed to introduce you at the beginning of the session. Monica is one of the architects, the founding technical director of the CISA program in Acre, the System for Incentives for Environmental Services, which put its law into place more than a decade ago, and it has been on the frontier of creating jurisdictional REDD programs. And after doing that for several years, she joined the Earth Innovations Institute's team as the coordinator of the Brazil program. And she will be speaking with us today about the perspective of the governments, of the state governments, and the challenges they face to bring their jurisdictional REDD programs to fruition. Monica.
Thank you, Dan. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you here in this session. Currently, the states, the Amazonian states, the 9 Amazonian states are being in this effort for a long time. As you said, Acre is in this issue for more than a decade. But all of them participate of the Governors for Climate and Forest Task Force since 2008. So this is a long time of commitments and putting efforts to design their strategies for mitigate climate change through this REDD+ mechanism. Even though some states that in some way attract finance to put in place their strategy. One of them was Acre first with the REM program, and after that, in 2015 and 17, was Mato Grosso to attract money from payment for result-based payments. So we're just two states that in some way were benefits from their efforts, and the rest of the states were just waiting for the opportunity to do that. All of the states in some way from this GCF task force initiative started to work and define their legal, institutional, and policy framework. All of them have plans for prevent and control deforestation and forest degradation. But the last years, with the suspension of the Amazon Fund and with economic crisis, they need or they have the expectative to participate in voluntary market to attract and raise the finance enough to put in place their strategy. All of them have multi-stakeholder long-term strategies for low carbon development. So as you mentioned, Mato Grosso have the inclusion, production, and conserve strategy. But also there are other states that are also working in those long-term strategies. But the finance is not in the scale needed to put in place these strategies. At the moment, when the jurisdictional or the interest for jurisdictional carbon credits started, and last year the LEAF coalition called for proposal, 8 states submitting their proposal for this coalition, and started to move forward to prepare their framework to attend the standard R3s. Since there, they are trying to identify the pathway to, sorry. The pathway to participate in this market, trying to identify the authority that they have, the institutional framework they need, and also the authorization that needs to have in order to sell carbon credits in the voluntary market. In this process, they also have the support of the GCF task force to move forward in this way. But they are looking to partners to bring upfront finance to implement the readiness they needed in this phase. As we said, Acre and Mato Grosso just get the REM program, and they have this financial resource to move in the implementation of their strategy. But the rest of the states still need get this finance and pass through this long time with many political cycles, without a clear signal to bring finance to these initiatives. It's really hard to maintain this political will through the political cycles they have. As we said, it's more than a decade, and at least 4 mandates were in place in this states in this time. So with every change they have in the political administration, it will be difficult to maintain the political will if they don't have a clear signal with upfront finance or a clear signal from the market that could bring the money enough to put in place their strategies. I am sorry, I am with this problem that everybody is faced at this moment, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Monica. And I want to highlight a question from Ken Andrasco. Hey, Ken. What is the time frame you estimate for Brazilian states to complete the set of legal and operational steps to realize their entry into global carbon markets? For example, assuming a new, more progressive presidency in Brazil, resolving federal state authority issues, putting the necessary framework in place. And I just want to say quickly that there are states that are over the next few months will begin their verification processes, that is submitting all of the necessary documents. What I didn't highlight in my opening comments is that today there have not been any jurisdictional red credits sold, okay? There's none out there. Guyana is right now the first in line, and they were able to prepare all of their documents under our trees in about 6 months, and are now in the verification process with the third party. And I certainly next year, some Brazilian states will be in that process as well. Some have historical credits to sell, right? So they do not need to generate the emissions reductions. They simply need to go through the certification process. And so Tocantins, for example, is quite far advanced in being able to get through those steps. And on the legal side, it's very opportune that Ludovino, despite battling his own version of COVID, not version, but the real thing, was able to join us today too. Ludovino Lopes is, it seems like wherever there's a legal question involving red in Brazil and in many other countries, there's Ludovino providing critical legal advice and assistance, and in many cases helping to structure the laws that are the foundation for these transactions. So we're really honored to have Ludovino with us to really talk about some of the legal dimensions of red, jurisdictional red within Brazil. And is it legally allowed, and what is the obstacle today? Ludovino.
Dan, thank you. So thank you. It's probably that during my words I need to interrupt a little because of the COVID year, but let's see and get the big framework, the big picture here. So jurisdictional is a mix between the standalone projects and the overall picture that you have described, Ronaldo has described in animal that is the jurisdiction needs to convey all those other things inside of its structure. So it needs to have the ability to maintain the relationship with the national infrastructure and the national legal framework, and also it should be able to do in the future what we call the nested approach with the standalone project. So I think jurisdictions is one of the most important pieces of that jigsaw, the most important pieces of that puzzle that is being constructed during these years. And I think we have two ways of addressing this. One is the fast track. If tomorrow the federal government in Brazil, as you already mentioned, just enact a regulatory procedure that just clarifies what is going to be the way that those jurisdictional red credits could be applied onto the international scenario, or as an ITMO, as Caroline said, or under Article 6.4 as part of a project approach. This is already been done in some ways in Brazil, if you consider the first step of the result-based payment structure. Of course, it's different, but sets the infrastructure to do it. The main infrastructure that is necessary to do it, at least the methodologies, the approach, the ability of the states to do it. So Acre and Mato Grosso have done these approaches. And the most important thing of that approaches are the creation of the legal infrastructure of those governments, of those states and those jurisdictions to do it. Because no one is going to trust in emission reduction credits coming from a jurisdiction that doesn't have a supportive, very robust legal infrastructure. And also, it doesn't have also the governance to do it, as Ronaldo told us. So in Brazil, we don't have nothing today that avoid us to sell credits in terms of the carbon red credits on the private standalone projects. It's part of the legal infrastructure of the country to allow these private projects to be sold. Also, if you think about the jurisdictional approach, there is no limitation to a prohibition, if I can say, to sell those credits. What is in the law, and it's not necessarily in the law prohibition, it's on the NDC, is a reserve of the federal government to consider or not as an instruments of market those kind of structures. So we don't have a prohibition, we have a limitation or a reserve that if the finalization or the intention of those transactions will be tuned to the United Nations Framework Convention or to a situation where you need to do a corresponding adjustment, you will need to have and go there and knock the door of the federal government. But the important thing is that today, even with the recent legal updates with the decree that has been brought at life in the 19th of May of this year, if you see there, the decree has maintained what the national policy of climate change has said and maintained the sectors of the previous legislation as the sectors that has to come and say what will be his composition and his contribution for the national declared contributions in the future, and what is going to be the first steps for the creation of the national carbon markets. If you see, forests are not there. I read it 10 times and I can find forests there indirectly, but not directly. So what is going to happen in my mind, and I think that's one of the questions that everybody's now, is what is going to be the way to deal with that? Are we going to consider and maintain those things as voluntary and not included necessarily on what we are doing? Are we going to transform them and being part of our NDC? And what is the size and the goal that we want to be part of that process? Are we going to, what is going to be the timeline where we transform it from the voluntary to the NDC to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as Caroline has said? So I think the tuning of that evolution is going to be clearly what is going to happen with the opportunity to transact those credits in the country. And so the fast track will be if the federal government say yes. The medium or long track will be the need to have those infrastructure and the legislations inside of each one of those states to assure the buyer that is going to buy robust, measurable, reported, verifiable credits in the jurisdictional space. So what I have to say is that no, there is no prohibition. It's just a question of set those infrastructures, those legal structures, and go together with the evolution of the regulatory procedures in the United Nations Framework Convention.
Okay, so there's no legal barriers to states transacting jurisdictional red carbon credits. And And yet there's still a lack of the design and the regulatory processes to set up the system nationally for allocating corresponding adjustments and in governing the entire process. We're coming down to the end of our time. We've got a question from Bruce Cabarly. What are the key risks, concerns that have kept the Brazilian federal government from agreeing with the Amazon states on a framework for determining corresponding adjustments for the international transfers of JRED emissions reductions? And I think I'd like to ask that each panelist now give about a 30-second intervention to final comment. And Carolini, if you could address this question, perhaps with an additional 30 seconds, since we're just about out of time. So quick interventions to close our webinar. Carolini.
Thank you, Dan. Well, I think the issue here is that Brazil still needs to understand how it's going to manage its carbon budget as a whole, not only in relation to the forest sector emissions. So once the Brazilian federal government can understand all the opportunities and what it can do to better, what are the options to better manage its carbon budget, you'll have to consider the forest sector emissions, and because we are still developing Article 6, it's all very recent now since the Glasgow decision last year. I think this process is still ongoing.
Thank you, Carolini. Over to you, Ronaldo. A final comment.
Well, yes. Regarding the corresponding adjustment, the Brazil government has created a commission to discuss that 3 months ago, and so far no discussion has taken place. And I think everybody is aware that Brazil was very much against the corresponding adjustment for 6.4, but not against the corresponding adjustment for 6.2. And we know that there'll be some people in Europe. The European Commission is taking care of the climate policy there. They've been saying they may be willing to take each move in their EU ETS, the cap and trade program that they have there. And so must there be a window of opportunity for trade? That is the only way this government of today will be discussing, because they already realized that this is something very important. Important also for Brazil to get into the OECD. So OECD. So I don't see the Brazilian government today take any step forward in order to make anything if there is no opportunity for do a trade and make these cases something like a financial success. But my final remarks are very much in line with what Carolina said, that we have several good initiatives in Brazil in climate policy. You have very bad ones, but you don't have a Green Deal. And we don't know how will be our trajectory towards 2030. I'm not saying your net zero commitment, which is 2050, is too much. Even to tomorrow, for the next year, we don't know what we're going to do. So, and the jurisdictional right coming from the subnational states is very important, because once they get into that, and they also see opportunities, trade opportunities, they are going to force the government to do something. And not only this government today, but the government tomorrow as well. So I think the jurisdictional right not only is a very good carbon credit, because the leakage and permanence control, and but also say they put together the stakeholders. There are several issues on social and environmental safeguards that are taking care the jurisdictional right, and also makes the government responsible for providing those credits. So this is a very good start to make it this government or the government tomorrow to think of how to organize our trajectory of using the carbon budget or even to decide how much is your carbon budget is. And so I thank you very much and congratulations, Dan, and all the authors, I include myself, for this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronaldo. Monica, I'm not sure if your voice is up to it, but 30-second closing intervention, please.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that, but as Ronaldo and Carol said, I think the pathway through jurisdictional red is almost in place, almost ready to join the market right now. There are some pieces that we need to work at least, but I think that the states are mobilized to that. And as the market bring the clear signal last year, they are more committed to explore this line. So as Ronaldo said, they are most close to the field and close to the actions that need to take place to mitigate climate change. So it could be good to support the states at the moment, where a long time that they are spend efforts to do that.
Thank you, Monica. Over to you, Ludovino, and I'll close with a final comment.
Okay, so I think the main conclusion for me, the most important one, is what we need now to do is to get up the sleeves and create the transition matrix. The transition matrix from now to 2015 or now to 2030, and to understand how all the sectors in Brazil are going to contribute to that transition. And with that, we will join the efforts to understand the real value and the importance of the jurisdictions on that process also. And I think this is the challenge now. And it's not only a technical and scientific challenge or an economic challenge, it's also a legal and regulatory challenge to address that. And if we can do that together, and if we can contribute to that, we'll be successful for sure.
Great, thank you, Ludovino. And in closing, we're out of time, we're over our time. We do have a very important question from Sven Bonder about, are the jurisdictions ready to really design and implement these models for making the transition to low emission forest friendly development? And the question is, it's very variable. The response is, I think it's quite variable. One of the main challenges is to get beyond command and control only, and to really think of what is the new development, what are the new economic base, building upon the existing economic bases, which in the case of something like cattle is, the main driver of deforestation, and clearly we need more intensive production systems. And those are all very active conversations in each of these jurisdictions. And what is exciting to me is this is no longer theoretical. Somewhere in the future, there will be a market demand for the emissions reductions that these states are capable of achieving, in collaboration with others, of course, with the federal government. But there's deals under discussion right now, and that makes it very different. There's the LEAF Coalition, but there's other deals as well with individual companies. The market has arrived. So in short, the market is ready to deliver a significant share of the missing finance for bending the arc on Amazon forest loss and degradation. And for that to happen, there's a lot of heavy lifting. There needs to be the national framework that's going to manage and govern this whole process. But there needs to be a critical point made by Monica: upfront finance. You can't get to those emissions reductions unless you can actually implement the program. And a couple of states have that possibility today, but most do not. So there's some important challenges ahead still, but this is a very, very promising moment in history for the Brazilian Amazon. Looking forward. Thank you all for participating. I'd like to thank the panelists, both as co-authors of this study and for your interventions today, for the audience for joining us and providing some very important questions. This is recorded, the webinar is recorded and will be available through YouTube, and we'll make that recording available to you shortly. Thank you all for your participation today.